Some moments don't announce themselves. They erase you quietly in front of everyone you've ever known. The Sterling Charity Gala was one of those nights where the chandeliers didn't just light the room, they exposed people. Crystal glasses clinked softly, orchestral music floated through the grand hall of the Manhattan Riverside Hotel, and every conversation carried the subtle language of status. Claire Morgan stood near the edge of the crowd, still as if she had been placed there by time itself rather than choice. Across the room, Ethan Brooks entered with effortless confidence, his hand resting lightly on the arm of his new companion, smiling in the way men smile when they believe their past has already been written off. He saw Claire within seconds, but his expression did not change. It was not anger, not surprise, but something colder, recognition without acknowledgement. He turned slightly, guiding his attention elsewhere, as if the space she occupied was no longer worth dividing his world. A few nearby guests followed his gaze and then quickly looked away, adjusting their judgments in real time. Claire did not react. Her posture remained composed, her hands gently clasped, her presence quiet enough to be mistaken for absence. Yet beneath that stillness was a memory that refused to stay buried. Years earlier, she and Ethan had built their life in a modest apartment where winter drafts slipped through thin windows and shared dreams kept them warm. She remembered late nights at a small kitchen table covered in receipts, plans, and unfinished conversations about a future they both once believed in. Back then, success had been a word they used carefully, as if speaking it too loudly might break its possibility. But success changed Ethan, or perhaps it revealed him. The memory faded as the present pressed in again, louder now with laughter from nearby tables where people whispered not her name, but her insignificance. Claire adjusted the strap of her simple black dress, not to impress, but to remain steady in a room that seemed determined to make her disappear. On the far side of the ballroom, a server accidentally brushed past her, offering a brief apology that felt more sincere than any greeting she had received all evening. Then, something shifted. A man in a tailored gray suit, carrying a leather briefcase that did not belong to the atmosphere of celebration, entered through the side corridor. He moved with purpose, scanning the room once before his eyes landed on Claire. He did not smile, did not hesitate, but there was recognition in his gaze that did not belong to coincidence. Slowly, he approached, stopping just outside the circle of noise that surrounded her invisibility. Ethan did not notice him yet. Neither did the crowd. But Claire did, and for the first time that evening, the silence around her felt like it was about to mean something different. The man in the tailored gray suit stopped just outside the edge of the gala lights, where conversations blurred into a single low hum that never quite reached Claire Morgan. For a moment, he simply observed her as if confirming something that had been settled long before tonight. Then he opened the leather briefcase in his hand with careful precision, drawing out a sealed envelope marked only with a black embossed seal. Claire did not move, but her attention tightened in a way no one else in the room could notice, as though her stillness had shifted from endurance into awareness. The man spoke quietly, his voice measured and formal, saying her name with the restraint of someone who had been instructed never to misplace it. Around them, the ballroom continued its performance of wealth and indifference, crystal chandeliers scattering light across polished marble floors, laughter rising and falling like waves that never touched the shore she stood on. Ethan Brooks had still not looked in their direction. He was too busy accepting a handshake from a board member of Sterling Holdings, his posture relaxed, his expression confident, as if the world had already agreed with every decision he had ever made. Claire accepted the envelope without comment, her fingers steady despite the weight it seemed to carry beyond paper. The man offered no explanation, only a slight nod, as if his role ended the moment the envelope left his possession. Then he stepped back and disappeared into the flow of guests as quietly as he had arrived. Claire turned the envelope once in her hands, noticing the faint impression of a name she recognized but could not immediately place in context. It was not urgency that made her hesitate, but memory, something unresolved threading through the edges of her thoughts. Years ago, there had been a name spoken in passing during a winter storm, a name attached to kindness that asked for nothing in return. She had been younger then, working multiple jobs, balancing exhaustion with determination, believing that survival itself was a form of progress. Back then, She had not known that small moments of compassion could echo forward in ways that changed the architecture of a life. A sudden shift in the crowd drew her attention upward. Ethan had finally noticed the subtle disruption at the edge of the ballroom. His gaze landed first on the man who had already left, then on the envelope in Claire's hand, and finally on Claire herself. There was no immediate recognition of significance in his expression, only mild curiosity, as though she had interrupted a narrative he no longer considered relevant. He excused himself from the conversation he was having and began walking toward her, his steps unhurried, confident in a familiarity that no longer truly existed. The guests nearby adjusted their attention accordingly, sensing a change in social gravity without understanding its source. Claire remained still, the envelope now resting against her palm like an unanswered question. For the first time that evening, the silence around her was no longer empty. It was waiting. Ethan approached within a few feet, his eyes flicking briefly to the envelope before returning to her face. He smiled faintly, not unkindly, but with the ease of someone who believed he already understood every possible outcome of their interaction. He said her name, and in that single word there was a history he had already reduced to something manageable. Claire looked at him, not with resentment, not with surprise, but with the quiet recognition of distance that cannot be shortened by familiarity alone. The room around them continued to shimmer with music and conversation, but something beneath it had begun to shift, subtle yet irreversible, like the first crack in glass that has already decided its direction. Claire lowered her gaze briefly to the envelope again, then back to Ethan, as if weighing not what he was saying, but what he no longer knew. The moment Ethan Brooks spoke her name again, Claire Morgan felt the distance between who she had been and who she had become stretch quietly inside her like a line pulled too tight, but not yet broken. His voice carried the same familiar confidence, the same ease of ownership over conversations that no longer belonged to him. Around them, the Sterling Charity Gala continued its elegant rhythm, guests moving like carefully placed pieces on a board of wealth and recognition, unaware that something beneath their certainty had already begun to shift. Ethan glanced at the envelope in her hand once more, his expression unchanged but his attention sharpened, as if noticing a detail that did not yet fit into the version of reality he preferred. He gave a small, polite smile, the kind reserved for situations he considered insignificant, and spoke as though they were still bound by the same chapter of life that Claire had already closed. He asked if she was attending alone, his tone light, almost courteous, yet threaded with the subtle assumption that her presence required explanation. Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she studied him with a calm that did not invite conflict but also did not offer comfort. In that pause, something in the atmosphere tightened, not visibly, but perceptibly, like the air before a distant storm. The guests nearby continued their conversations, but a few had begun to sense the irregularity of attention gathering at the edge of the ballroom. Claire finally responded with a simple acknowledgement, her voice steady and measured, carrying neither resentment nor eagerness. It was not the content of her words that unsettled Ethan, but the absence of reaction he expected from her. He adjusted his stance slightly, as if recalibrating the dynamic between them, then allowed his gaze to drift again toward the envelope. There was a flicker of curiosity now, thin but present, like the first sign of doubt in something previously unquestioned. Before he could speak further, the man in the gray suit reappeared briefly at a distance, speaking quietly with one of the event coordinators near the entrance of the main hall. His presence was subtle but intentional, and Claire noticed it again, recognizing that nothing about his arrival had been accidental. She tightened her grip on the envelope without opening it, sensing that whatever lay inside was not meant to be consumed quickly, but understood at the right moment. Ethan followed her brief glance and turned his attention in the same direction, but saw nothing that seemed significant enough to hold. Still, the shift had already begun within him, even if he could not yet name it. He made a light remark about the evening, something about business partners and social appearances, trying to re-establish the familiar structure of conversation where he remained in control. Claire listened without interruption, her silence carrying more weight than agreement or disagreement ever could. In that silence, fragments of the past surfaced briefly, uninvited yet clear. She remembered mornings where ambition had been shared like a promise, not a competition, and evenings where exhaustion had been softened by belief in something larger than circumstance. Those memories did not bring nostalgia, they brought clarity. Ethan, sensing the lack of emotional response he was used to receiving, began to speak more, filling the space between them with commentary that now sounded less certain than before. The guests around them had started to notice the interaction, not because of what was being said, but because of how little of it seemed to matter to Claire. She was not reacting in ways that confirmed his expectations, and that alone was beginning to unsettle the balance he had unconsciously relied upon. Then, without warning, a new presence entered the conversation from behind the crowd. A senior attorney from Sterling Holdings stepped forward, holding a sealed document identical in design to the envelope Claire already carried. The attorney's expression was formal, composed, and deliberate, and when he addressed Claire, he did so with a level of respect that immediately shifted the attention of those nearby. Ethan's smile faded slightly, not completely, but enough to suggest a recalibration of perception. Claire turned toward the attorney, her expression still controlled, but now marked by a subtle awareness that whatever was unfolding had moved beyond coincidence. The ballroom, once filled with the effortless flow of celebration, seemed to slow around them, as if the room itself was beginning to recognize that something significant was about to be revealed, though no one yet understood what it was or who it would ultimately change. The attorney in the formal suit stepped closer, and for the first time that evening the atmosphere inside the Sterling Charity Gala lost its effortless rhythm, replaced by a stillness that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Claire Morgan remained composed, her attention fixed on the sealed document the attorney held, while Ethan Brooks watched with a subtle shift in expression that suggested curiosity was beginning to override confidence. The attorney did not rush. Instead, he positioned himself at a respectful distance, allowing the silence to settle before speaking, as though the weight of his words required space to exist properly. He addressed Claire directly, her full name spoken with careful precision, and in that moment several nearby conversations slowed, then faded entirely as attention naturally drifted toward the center of the room. Claire did not respond immediately. Her fingers tightened slightly around the envelope she already held, the texture of the seal grounding her in a reality that was becoming less familiar with each passing second. Ethan glanced between Claire and the attorney, his earlier composure now layered with a faint uncertainty he had not anticipated. He attempted a light remark, something meant to reassert familiarity and control, but the sound of his voice felt misplaced, as if it belonged to a version of the evening that was no longer continuing. The attorney opened the second envelope with careful deliberation, revealing documents that bore the insignia of Sterling Holdings, a name that carried weight far beyond the room they stood in. At that exact moment, the ambient energy of the gala shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Guests who had previously been engaged in private conversations now turned openly, sensing that something official was unfolding. Claire's past with Ethan, once a closed chapter in his mind, now seemed to exist in a different light, though neither of them had yet been given the full reason. The attorney began to speak, referencing a series of events tied to a private estate and a legacy that had been arranged years earlier under conditions that required absolute confidentiality. Each word was measured, formal, and carefully chosen, but the effect was not in the language itself, rather in the reactions it created. Ethan's expression tightened slightly as he tried to place the context, his confidence slowly giving way to calculation. He looked at Claire again, this time not with indifference, but with a growing sense that she was connected to something he had never bothered to understand. Claire, however, remained still. There was no visible reaction, no attempt to interrupt or clarify. Instead, she appeared to be listening to something that had begun long before this moment, as if the attorney's words were only confirming a truth she had not yet fully accepted. The envelope in her hand suddenly felt heavier, not physically, but in meaning, and she lowered her gaze to it briefly before returning her attention forward. The attorney paused, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for anticipation to become uncomfortable, then continued, stating that the contents of the will required immediate acknowledgement from all present legal parties and beneficiaries. The word beneficiaries hung in the air longer than anything else, drawing attention not only from Ethan but from several senior guests who understood the implications of such a designation. A faint murmur passed through the room, quickly contained but impossible to erase completely. Ethan took a step forward, attempting to interject with a question framed as clarification, but his tone betrayed something closer to unease than authority. The attorney acknowledged him briefly but did not yield the focus of the announcement. Instead, he turned his attention back to Claire, as if she remained the central point around which everything else was arranged. In that moment, Claire felt something shift within her understanding, not as revelation, but as recognition of a pattern she had never been given the full context to see. The gala, the attention, the sealed documents, and the presence of a legal authority all converged into a single direction that had not yet been fully spoken aloud. Ethan's gaze lingered on her longer now, searching for something familiar to anchor himself, but finding less of it with each passing second. The attorney prepared to continue, and the room collectively held its breath without realizing it had done so. The attorney did not immediately continue, as though he understood that every additional second of silence was no longer empty, but loaded with expectation that had already begun to reshape the room. Claire Morgan stood at the center of that silence, still holding the sealed document, her expression composed but no longer distant in the way it had been earlier in the evening. Something had changed in the way she occupied space, subtle enough that most would not yet name it, but undeniable to those who had begun paying closer attention. Ethan Brooks, standing only a few steps away, shifted his weight slightly, his earlier ease replaced by a quiet tension that he had not yet acknowledged to himself. The attorney finally spoke again, his voice steady and formal, stating that the document in Claire's possession and the accompanying will had been prepared under direct instruction from the late Richard Sterling, whose name immediately altered the atmosphere in the room in a way no introduction could soften. A faint ripple of recognition moved through the guests, not all of them understanding the full implications, but all of them recognizing the weight associated with that name in financial and philanthropic circles across the United States. Ethan's expression changed for the first time since the conversation began. It was not dramatic, but precise, like a calculation adjusting itself after an unexpected variable had entered the equation. He looked at Claire again, but now his gaze carried something closer to reassessment than indifference. The attorney continued, explaining that Claire Morgan had been explicitly named in a confidential provision tied to Sterling Holdings, a provision that required immediate disclosure under the terms of succession protocol. At the mention of Sterling Holdings, several guests subtly adjusted their posture, and a few conversations around the edges of the ballroom completely stopped. Claire remained silent, but the stillness in her posture had shifted. It was no longer the stillness of someone enduring a moment, but of someone absorbing information that she had not yet fully integrated into her understanding of herself. The attorney then carefully outlined that Richard Sterling had maintained a private relationship with Claire Morgan for several years, not in public recognition, but through a series of discreet and documented interactions that had been verified through legal correspondence and witness confirmation. The words did not create noise in the room, but they changed its temperature. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, and for the first time, he looked unsettled rather than simply curious. He took a small step forward, as if trying to position himself closer to clarity, but the attorney raised a hand gently, signaling that the process would continue without interruption. Claire finally lifted her eyes fully toward the attorney, her expression unchanged in emotion but sharper in focus, as though she was now listening not only to the present explanation but also to the implications forming behind it. The attorney proceeded to state that under the terms of the revised testament, Claire Morgan was designated as the sole beneficiary of a controlling interest within Sterling Holdings, contingent upon specific legal affirmations that would be executed following this formal reading. The phrase sole beneficiary did not echo in the room because of volume, but because of weight. Several guests reacted physically, small movements of disbelief or recalibration, while others simply froze in place. Ethan did not speak, but his attention locked fully onto Claire now, as if the space between what he thought he knew and what was being revealed had suddenly become unbridgeable. Claire's hand, still holding the envelope, lowered slightly, not in shock, but in recognition that the meaning of what she had carried into this room had expanded far beyond expectation. The attorney paused again, allowing the implications to settle, then added that this arrangement had been structured in accordance with Richard Sterling's final directive, which emphasized continuity, discretion, and personal judgment of character over public association or family hierarchy. At that, the room seemed to collectively understand that this was no longer a simple legal reading, but a restructuring of perceived reality within the very social fabric they had gathered under. Ethan's earlier confidence had fully dissolved into silence, and for the first time since the evening began, he looked at Claire not as someone from his past, but as someone he had never truly known at all. For several seconds after the attorney's words settled into the room, no one spoke, as if the Sterling Charity Gala had been placed inside a transparent pause that no one knew how to break. The weight of what had just been declared did not explode into noise or reaction. Instead, it sank slowly into every corner of the ballroom, altering posture, attention, and breath without permission. Claire Morgan remained still at the center of that silence, her expression unchanged, yet something within her awareness had begun to align in ways that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. The name Sterling Holdings no longer felt abstract or distant, and the phrase sole beneficiary did not register as noise, but as confirmation of something that had been quietly approaching her life long before this night. Ethan Brooks, standing only a few steps away, no longer carried the ease he had worn earlier. His attention was fixed now, not casually but fully, as though the space between them had become unstable. He looked at Claire with an expression that was no longer anchored in dismissal or familiarity, but in a growing uncertainty he could not yet translate into words. The attorney waited, allowing the silence to serve its purpose, then continued with the same controlled precision, explaining that Richard Sterling's final directives had been executed under strict legal oversight, ensuring that no public or private influence could alter the designation once confirmed. The phrasing was formal, but the meaning beneath it was unmistakable. Claire Morgan had not been placed near influence. She had been placed at the center of it. A faint shift moved through the guests, subtle but collective, as people began to adjust their understanding of who they were standing near. Conversations that had once defined social positioning now felt secondary, almost irrelevant. Ethan took a small step forward, not aggressive, not assertive, but instinctive, as though proximity might restore clarity. His voice, when it came, was controlled but lower than before, asking a question framed as logic rather than emotion, attempting to place this revelation within a structure that still made sense to him. The attorney acknowledged the question without fully yielding to it, stating that the documentation had been verified across multiple independent legal channels, including private trust records and witness validation spanning several years. Claire's gaze remained steady, but now it was no longer passive. There was something in her attention that suggested she was no longer simply receiving information, but beginning to understand the shape of a past she had not been fully allowed to see. The envelope in her hand, once a simple object, now felt like a physical link to a history that extended beyond her own memory. Ethan's expression tightened slightly as he processed the implications, his earlier assumptions beginning to fracture under the weight of details that did not align with the narrative he had carried for years. Around them, the guests had stopped pretending not to listen. Even those who had initially turned away were now fully engaged, their attention drawn not by spectacle, but by the irreversible nature of what was unfolding. The attorney continued, clarifying that Claire Morgan's designation was not symbolic or honorary, but structural, granting her authority contingent upon formal acknowledgement procedures that would follow the public reading. The phrase structural authority lingered longer than the rest, because it implied permanence rather than possibility. Claire finally lowered her eyes briefly, not in submission, but in reflection, as if measuring the distance between the life she had lived and the reality now being described to her. Ethan watched that small movement closely, searching for hesitation, doubt, or recognition of imbalance. But what he saw instead was composure deepening rather than breaking. It unsettled him more than any dramatic reaction could have. The attorney concluded this section by stating that Richard Sterling had intentionally excluded conventional succession expectations in favor of a designation based on personal trust, independent of family hierarchy or public association. That final clarification shifted the room again, because it removed any assumption of predictability. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze no longer moving between documents or officials, but remaining fixed on Claire as if seeing her for the first time without the filters he had relied on before. Claire did not speak. She did not need to. The silence around her had changed its meaning entirely, no longer signaling absence, but arrival. The Sterling Ballroom no longer felt like a place designed for celebration. It had become something closer to a suspended moment in time, where every detail remained visually unchanged but emotionally redefined by what had just been revealed. Claire Morgan stood at the center of it, surrounded by luxury that now felt distant, almost irrelevant to the new gravity forming around her identity. The attorney's final words still lingered in the air, not as sound, but as consequence. Ethan Brooks remained only a few steps away, his posture no longer relaxed or performative, but visibly restrained, as though every movement required reconsideration. His gaze did not leave Claire, yet it no longer carried familiarity. It carried recalibration, as if he were attempting to reconstruct a version of her that matched the reality now being presented. The attorney adjusted his stance slightly, then continued with controlled precision, stating that the formal acknowledgement process required public confirmation of Claire Morgan's designation in accordance with Sterling Holdings' legal governance structure. That phrase alone shifted attention across the entire room, because it transformed what had seemed like a private revelation into a public restructuring of power. A few guests instinctively stepped closer, not physically intruding, but emotionally drawn into proximity with a moment that would define reputation long after the evening ended. Claire remained silent, her expression steady, but her stillness now carried a different meaning. It was no longer the stillness of someone observing from the margins. It was the stillness of someone standing within the center of irreversible change. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice controlled but noticeably lower in confidence than before, asking for clarification that was no longer framed as casual inquiry, but as necessity. The attorney acknowledged him briefly, then clarified that all prior assumptions regarding inheritance distribution, family hierarchy, and corporate succession had been superseded by a sealed directive authored directly by Richard Sterling and validated under independent legal review. As those words settled, Ethan's expression tightened further, not in anger, but in the quiet recognition that the structure he had once relied on to interpret people and outcomes no longer applied. He looked at Claire again, and this time there was no attempt at familiarity in his gaze. There was only examination, as if trying to locate the point where understanding had failed him in the past. Claire, however, did not return the same search. Her attention was no longer focused on him in the way it had been earlier in the evening. Instead, she appeared to be absorbing the broader reality unfolding around her, as though the world she had entered was still revealing its own rules one layer at a time. The attorney proceeded, explaining that Claire Morgan's designation was not contingent upon external approval beyond the legal confirmation being executed in real time, and that upon completion of formal acknowledgement, authority over the designated holdings would transfer in accordance with pre-established governance protocol. The phrase transfer of authority caused a visible reaction among several guests, subtle but unmistakable, as people began to understand that what they were witnessing was not symbolic recognition but structural change. Ethan's hands remained still, but the tension in his posture suggested restraint rather than ease. He took a small breath, then spoke again, attempting to place Claire within a context he could still interpret, but the words felt increasingly disconnected from the reality forming in front of him. Claire did not interrupt. She did not correct. She simply listened, her presence calm but increasingly defined by something that no longer required explanation. The attorney paused briefly, then concluded this segment of the declaration by stating that all conditions set forth by Richard Sterling had been met under confidentiality protocol, and that the final step now required only acknowledgement from Claire herself. The room collectively shifted its attention toward her at that statement, not because she demanded it, but because everything now depended on it. Claire lowered her gaze slightly, not in hesitation, but in reflection, as though weighing not the legality of the moment, but its meaning. Ethan watched her closely, and for the first time, his expression held something closer to uncertainty than judgment. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was waiting for her to define what came next. The silence that followed the attorney's final statement was no longer fragile. It had become structured, as if the entire ballroom had unconsciously reorganized itself around the expectation of Claire Morgan's response. Every eye in the Sterling Charity Gala now carried a different weight, no longer observing a social moment, but a historical pivot that none of them had anticipated when the evening began. Claire stood at the center of it, her posture unchanged, yet the meaning of her presence had transformed completely. The envelope in her hand was no longer an object of uncertainty. It was now a symbol of confirmation waiting for acknowledgement. Ethan Brooks remained only a short distance away, but the space between them felt significantly larger than before, as though time itself had inserted something unbridgeable into their shared history. His expression held no longer the ease of a man accustomed to control, but the stillness of someone recalculating assumptions that no longer applied. The attorney turned slightly toward Claire, maintaining the same formal precision that had defined every statement he had made that evening, and confirmed that the final step of execution required her explicit acknowledgement of the Sterling directive. The phrasing was not emotional, but its impact resonated through the room with undeniable force. Claire slowly lifted her gaze from the envelope, not abruptly, but with a measured awareness that suggested she was no longer simply receiving information, but stepping into authorship of it. For a brief moment, she looked across the room, not at the guests, not at the structure of wealth surrounding her, but at the history she had unknowingly been part of. Ethan watched her closely, his earlier confidence now replaced with something far more uncertain, as if he were trying to locate the version of Claire he believed he understood. But that version no longer aligned with the reality standing before him. The attorney proceeded to restate the final designation in clear legal terms, confirming that Claire Morgan had been named sole controlling beneficiary of Sterling Holdings under conditions that required only her acknowledgement to activate full authority transfer protocols. The phrase controlling beneficiary landed with a different kind of silence than before, heavier, more permanent, as though the room itself understood that the structure of influence it had operated within was no longer stable. Several guests shifted subtly, some exchanging brief glances, others lowering their gaze entirely as the implications settled in. Claire did not react in the way the room might have expected. There was no visible shock, no outward hesitation. Instead, there was stillness that carried depth, as though she was measuring the distance between what she had believed her life to be and what it had actually contained without her knowledge. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier confidence, asking not for control, but for comprehension. His question did not challenge the legal process, but rather the logic of what he was witnessing, as if trying to anchor himself in reasoning that no longer held stability. The attorney acknowledged him briefly, then clarified that all conditions had been established years prior under direct instruction from Richard Sterling, whose intent had been to ensure that the designation would remain independent of public influence or familial expectation. That clarification did not restore order for Ethan. Instead, it removed the final assumption he had been relying on. Claire's attention returned fully to the attorney, but now her expression carried something subtle yet significant, a recognition forming not of power, but of origin. It was as if fragments of her past that had never fully made sense were beginning to align into a structure she could finally perceive. The ballroom, once filled with the soft rhythm of luxury and social performance, now felt like a chamber of suspended consequence. No one moved without awareness of the moment unfolding at its center. The attorney waited once more, signaling that only one action remained: Claire's acknowledgement. The room collectively held its breath again, but this time it was not waiting for revelation. It was waiting for acceptance. Claire's hand tightened slightly around the envelope, then steadied. She did not look at Ethan. She did not look at the crowd. Her focus remained forward, where everything that had been prepared long before this night now converged into a single irreversible point of decision. The ballroom remained suspended in a silence that no longer felt like anticipation alone, but like the final moment before a structure completes its collapse into a new form. Claire Morgan stood at the center of that silence, the sealed document still resting in her hand, her posture unchanged yet now carrying the undeniable weight of recognition that the entire room had begun to feel in unison. The attorney waited, maintaining formal stillness, his presence now less like an announcer and more like a witness to a threshold that had already been reached. Ethan Brooks did not speak. He no longer seemed certain that his voice would restore anything, and for the first time since the evening began, his attention remained fixed on Claire without interruption, as though any distraction might cause him to miss the moment something irreversible was completed. Claire slowly lifted her gaze toward the attorney, not hurried, not hesitant, but deliberate in a way that suggested she was no longer outside the meaning of what was happening, but standing fully inside it. The room seemed to narrow around her focus, every guest, every chandelier reflection, every fragment of conversation reduced to background detail. The attorney spoke once more, confirming that only her acknowledgement remained to finalize the execution of Sterling Holdings' directive, and that all legal frameworks were already in effect pending her response. For a brief instant, even time seemed to soften its pace, as if waiting for the exact phrasing of her choice. Claire inhaled quietly, her expression calm, and when she spoke, her voice carried no hesitation, only clarity, stating that she acknowledged the directive in full accordance with its legal terms. The words were simple, but their effect was immediate and absolute. A subtle shift moved through the ballroom, not loud, not dramatic, but deeply structural, as though invisible lines of authority had just repositioned themselves around her presence. The attorney gave a small, respectful nod, then confirmed the completion of formal acknowledgement. In that confirmation, something intangible became final. Several guests reacted in restrained disbelief, some covering their mouths slightly, others simply standing still as the reality settled in layers. Ethan's expression tightened, not in anger, but in a quiet rupture of understanding, as if the version of events he had carried for years had finally encountered something it could no longer contain. He took a half step forward, then stopped, his hand lowering without gesture, realizing that no intervention or interpretation he could offer would alter what had already been set into motion. Claire lowered the envelope slightly, no longer holding it as uncertainty, but as closure. The attorney stepped back, signaling the completion of his role, and for the first time, the room was left without procedural voice, only consequence. Claire turned slightly, not toward Ethan, not toward the crowd, but toward the open space of the ballroom exit, where the world beyond the gala waited without ceremony. As she began to walk, the guests instinctively parted, not out of instruction, but out of recognition that something about her presence had fundamentally changed its category within their understanding. Ethan finally spoke her name, softly, almost instinctively, but it did not carry authority, only recognition of distance too large to cross. Claire paused for only a fraction of a second, not turning fully, then continued forward. Outside the ballroom doors, the quiet hum of the city beyond the Sterling Hotel felt distant yet real, a contrast to the suspended world she was leaving behind. A black vehicle waited at the entrance, its presence unannounced but expected, as if it had always been part of the evening's final structure. Claire approached it without urgency, without spectacle, and without looking back. Behind her, the ballroom remained filled with people who had just witnessed a shift they would each interpret differently for years to come. Ethan stood among them, no longer defined by certainty, watching the space she had just left behind as if it still contained the version of reality he had lost without realizing it was possible to lose. Claire reached the vehicle, paused only briefly before entering, and as the door closed softly behind her, the world of sterling lights, whispered assumptions, and redefined power remained on the other side, no longer holding her place within it. The vehicle pulled away smoothly into the night, and inside, there was no celebration, no declaration, only quiet continuity, as if something that had always been hers had finally been allowed to be seen. And in the distance, beneath the fading glow of the gala entrance, Ethan remained still, understanding at last that some departures do not announce themselves with emotion, but with permanence.